He began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug out a pit for a winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenant farmers and went away. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the farmers to collect some of the fruit of the vineyard from them. But they took him, beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent another servant to them. They hit him on the head and treated him shamefully. Then he sent another, and they killed that one. He also sent many others. Some they beat, others they killed. He still had one to send, his beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But those tenant farmers said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and kill the farmers and give the vineyard to others. Haven't you read the scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This came about from the Lord and is wonderful in our eyes. They were looking for a way to arrest him, but feared the crowd because they knew he had spoken this parable against them. So they left him and went away. This is the Lord's word for us today. You may be seated.
Oh no, a guest speaker. It'll be fine. I'm going to try something different this morning. I'm going to use my phone with a text. I see young people doing that, and so I'm thinking, I can do this. And you will know as well as I do by the end if it has worked. But I got my printed copy just in case. So here we go. All right, my name is Snyder. My wife and I, Sue, have been a part of Wingfoot, been around Wingfoot for a little over a year now. But my history with John and Kelly goes back much farther than that. I was on staff at Riverwood with John for years before he came here, and I've known Kelly for an embarrassing amount of time. Embarrassing to her. But anyway, if we told such stories, well, we won't. But yeah, it's my privilege to be here this morning. Thank you, John, for this honor. As we look at this passage in Scripture. Before we get started with that, there was a TV show that was popular. I think it was on for like 11 years, and it spawned spin-offs in like a dozen different countries. The name of the show was Undercover Boss. Familiar? Some of you familiar with that? It's one of those shows that if I was channel surfing and it was on, sometimes we'd stop and watch it. It wasn't anything that I would like plan my day around. But an interesting premise. In the show Undercover Boss, a CEO, an executive, maybe an owner, somebody high up in a company would literally go undercover in his own company. They put on they disguise him in such a way, and he would go undercover. And let's say the company was a restaurant chain. Well, he would go into a restaurant into an entry-level position. And they would tell everybody else that was there that he was interviewing for this job, but they were also making a documentary. That's why all the cameras would follow this guy around. So they're making a documentary. He's trying out these different jobs. They're recording it all. And so he would do these jobs, and he would see how the company would work. And it was rather formulaic in that, suspiciously so, that every episode, there was always probably one employee that maybe wasn't doing things as well, and here's the boss, but they don't know it, and he's taking notes. But then there was also an outstanding employee. There was always one of these outstanding employees that loved his job, and he had all sorts of ideas on how to make the company better. And this is where the suspicious part comes in. There was always some heartbreaking story that went along with this person. They had a mother that needed surgery, or their car broke down and they had to walk to work 5 miles, and because of some geological anomaly, it was uphill both ways. It was always, there's always this sob story, and so at the end, they would call the employees in. He'd do various jobs, and there's always one employee that would always say to the camera, "Oh, he didn't do a very good job," and not knowing who he was. And then at the end, they'd bring him in, or the employees would come in and he would reveal himself, and sometimes they would implement changes. More often than not, they'd buy the guy a new car or whatever, and then they went on. On a few occasions, there were some issues where they really had to be resolved, and some changes took place. But that whole premise kind of reminds me of where we're at in Mark. Now, we've been in Mark since last Easter. We started in Mark in Easter. We're going to be in Mark until next Easter. And if you remember last week, John promised that by Easter there'll be no more snow. So we have that on our side. We'll see how that goes. But we've come into the portion of Mark this last week. 2 weeks ago, we looked at Palm Sunday. And so the rest of the book, from Mark 11 all the way to the end, is that last week in Jesus' life, the Passion Week. And so it's the Jesus coming into Jerusalem. It's the Jesus coming to the temple that kind of reminds me a little bit of Undercover Boss. Now, I want to be careful of how far I push the analogy. It's not like Jesus became human so he could come down to earth and see how well things were going. Of course, he knew how things were going. But there's just that aspect of him coming to the temple, this massive, this beautiful structure that in some respects was built for his glory. And everything that went on in that temple was for his glory and for the people to meet the glory of God. And so he comes into this temple. And throughout the Gospels, we see him encountering people whose faith is really strong and impressive, like those outstanding employees. But then we see others, well, maybe not so much. So this morning, we're going to take a look at that first parable in Mark 12. So if you have your Bible, if you're not there already, we'll start in Mark 12 with this parable that Jesus teaches. Now, actually, before we start in Mark 12, let's get a little bit of a running start. As we said, this whole section from 11 on is 1 week. And that week starts on a Sunday. If you remember 2 weeks ago, we looked at it, and we call it Palm Sunday. It's the Sunday that Jesus rode triumphantly into Jerusalem on that Sunday, and the people are singing his praises. He's riding a donkey, as John pointed out 2 weeks ago. He's riding this donkey, not a horse or a war horse, but a humble donkey, and that's very symbolic. It's very prophetic. It has very significant meanings. But we have that Palm Sunday in Mark 11, 1 through 11, and that we looked at 2 weeks ago. But then it ends kind of abruptly. He says Jesus went to the temple, he kind of looked around, it's late, and so he leaves. And that's Sunday. Then Monday, he comes back to the temple. So last week we looked at that. We looked at Jesus coming back to the temple, and that is if the first week was Palm Sunday, we call this the day that Jesus cleansed the temple. And John gave us a really good theology of what temples are. And if you remember, he showed us this diagram of what temples looked like. Can we have that first slide of what temples looked like and how they were set up? And so this is an overview of the temple from above in a very simplistic way, of course. But in that holy place is the Holy of Holies. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was and where the glory of God resided. That's the part that the the high priest would only go into once a year on the Day of Atonement. And then outside of that was the Israelites' courtyard. This is where the daily routine, this is where the daily work, if you will, the daily sacrifices in the temple would take place. This is where the Jews would come in and do their sacrifices. The priests would sacrifice the animals that they bring. And then outside of that was the court of the Gentiles for the nations. And if you remember, John walked us through the concept, the theology of a temple from Genesis, where you have Eden in the garden, and then the outer world that was to be cultivated. We've got the theology throughout of what temples were for, a place of meeting God, even down to in the New Testament, where that metaphor is applied to us, each one of us individually. We are now a temple of the Holy Spirit, but then also the church gathered, all of us, all y'all are a temple as well. It's a great vision throughout, the string that goes through the whole Old and New Testament about the role of the temple and the role of temples. On this Sunday, though, or on this day, now we're on Monday, is when Jesus cleanses the temple. And this is what the temple would have looked like. Here's a picture of what the temple, this is a model, obviously, but this is what the temple, the second temple in Israel, would have looked like at the time of Jesus. Now, we're facing, as we look at it, we're facing west. So this is the eastern wall. The western wall that still exists today would be that outer wall on the other side. That tall little thing in the center, that's the Holy of Holies. That's where the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant was. That's where the high priest would go into once a year. And then you have the rest of that building on the inside. That's where the Jews would do their sacrifices and that was for the Israelites. And then that big courtyard all around inside the rectangle, but that big courtyard, that's the courtyard of the Gentiles. That was the place for Gentiles and, quite frankly, women as well, because they weren't permitted inside the inner either. But that was the place for all nations. If you were a convert, if you were from the other nations, you could come, and that's where you could worship as well. And so that's the portion where this is going on, that Jesus does his cleansing, what we call the cleansing of the temple. Now, the week of Passover in Jerusalem, the place would have been packed. It would have been swamped with people. The population of Jerusalem at the time of the week of Passover would have just swelled beyond. It would have been like New Orleans on Mardi Gras. It would have been a city in Florida. I can't think of any. It would have been any of the beaches in Florida. Jeez. It would have been like any of the beaches. Fort Lauderdale. That's what I'm trying to think of. It would have been like Fort Lauderdale in spring break. It would have been wherever the Super Bowl is this year, that week leading up. Just people from literally all over the known world. In fact, in Acts 2, if you remember in Acts 2, when the Holy Spirit comes upon the church and they start speaking, people from all over the world, Jews that were there, hear the gospel in their own language. So Acts 2, Pentecost, would have only been 7 weeks after Passover. So a lot of people would come to Jerusalem for Passover, stay for Pentecost, and then go home because they traveled. And it says there were Parthians, Medes, Elamites, people from Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, Libya, Cyrene, Rome. People from all over, going to Jerusalem to worship the Passover, to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem was something that most every Jew had as a goal at least once in their life. And so the city would have been packed. Now, when people traveled that far to come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, there were two things to worship in the temple that had to take place. One, they had to exchange money. because the temple took a very specific type of currency. So even if you're coming from Rome, and Rome, covered out everything, the Roman currency wasn't good in the temple. So they had to exchange their money for the local currency. And most of these people, they wanted to sacrifice something in the temple, and usually for Passover, because there were just so many people and so much was going on, the kind of the go-to sacrifice was a dove. Well, instead of bringing your own dove from home and all that, you could buy one when we get there. So you picture this courtyard is just packed with literal money changers, people that are exchanging currency, people that are selling doves. And if human nature is anything like it was back then, I'm sure there's other merchandise. I was in Jerusalem for Passover mugs, and stuff like that. Well, maybe not that, but there was certainly selling animals, changing the money and that kind of stuff. And really, it had turned into a marketplace. And in and of itself, that's probably fine. It's just that with so many people, and it was so crowded, and of course, again, human nature kicking in, the price of doves the week of Passover is like the price of gas on the 4th of July. Everything goes up, the money exchanges, and that's when Jesus comes in, and those are the people that he starts flipping the tables and says, you've turned what should have been this place of prayer for all the nations into a den of thieves. Because they were price gouging, they were taking advantage of the people. What should have been a place for the nations to come and worship had become nothing more than Macy's on Good Friday. No, not Good Friday, Black Friday. A den of thieves. Jesus does all this, he cleanses the temple, he throws them out or disrupts what's going on, and then he leaves. And that's the end of Monday. Tuesday, he comes back to the temple. And this, if you remember, we looked at this a little bit last week. On their way to the temple, that's when he passes the fig tree, and they all notice that the fig tree that he'd cursed yesterday is now withered. And then he comes into the temple, and the Jews confront him. We see this at the end of chapter 11, verse 20. The Jews are confronting him, and it's not surprised that the Jewish leaders, the chief priests, the scribes, they're all there. I mean, this is their week. And here this rabbi comes in and he does all this. And so when he comes back the next day, they confront him and they say, by what authority do you do this? Who gives you the authority to do this in the temple? And if you remember, at first he doesn't answer them. He asks them a question that they can't answer, and there's some awkwardness there. And then we get to chapter 12, verse 1. He begins to speak to them in parables. Mark 12, chapter 1, he says this parable. He begins to speak to them in parables. And the them there is, of course, everybody that's gathered, but it's primarily these chief priests, these scribes, these elders, these leaders of the temple who are confronting Jesus, and in some respects, rightfully so, asking him, what authority do you have to do this? And so now he begins to speak to them in parables. And if there's any question, if they knew what he was talking about, that's answered at the end in verse 12. They, again, these group of three, these three types of people, the scribes, the chief priests, the elders, they were looking for a way to arrest him, Jesus, but feared the crowds because they knew he had spoken this parable against them. They knew who he was talking about when he gave this parable. They knew what he was saying. Many of Jesus' parables were a little vague or a little obscure, and they needed to be explained afterwards, or maybe some of them didn't even make sense until after his resurrection. This one was very clear from the start. He began to speak to them in parables, and he says, a man planted a vineyard. He puts a fence around it, he dug out a pit for a wine press, built a watchtower, and then he leased it to tenant farmers, and he went away. This would have been a very familiar story. A very familiar story for two reasons. One, because this happened in Israel this was a common practice where landowners who were not present, they're absent landowners, they lived somewhere else, but they would own land and they would lease it out to farmers. So they'd get everything ready. They'd plant the vineyards, they'd get the wine press, they'd get everything ready, and then they would lease it out. And locals would work the land, in this case a vineyard. They would work the vineyard, and then when the crops would come in and were sold, of course, then the landowner would get his cut. So this was a very common practice. So when Jesus starts telling this story, this is a parable that's a very common practice in their time. But it would also be very familiar for another reason. Because this same analogy, this same idea of someone planting a vineyard, we find in Isaiah 5. Look at this passage here in Isaiah 5. This is Isaiah 5, verses 1 through 7. It says, I will sing about the one I love, a song about my loved one's vineyard. The one I love had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. And look at the parallels. You see how Jesus weaves in the parallels here. He broke up the soil. He cleared it of stones and planted it with the finest vines. He built a tower in the middle of it and even dug out a wine press there. He expected it to yield good grapes, but it yielded worthless grapes. Now, this is where the story starts to diverge. But this setting would have been very common, and they would have, especially the scribes, the chief priests, the elders, being scholars in the Old Testament, well, being scholars in what they knew as the Bible at the time, they would have recognized this immediately. The parallels are so obvious. And obviously, the person who's planting the vineyard is God. And the vineyard is Israel. So we have God in creation, creating, and it's just the idea of the perfection, or everything was right and ready to go. The land had been prepared. All the rocks had been removed. A wall of protection had been built around it. There was a tower. Everything was ready to go and should have been fine. Now, here's where the stories diverge, because if you keep reading in Isaiah 5, he expected that to yield good grapes, but it yielded worthless grapes. So now, residents of Jerusalem and men of Judea, please judge between me and my vineyard. What more could I have done for my vineyard than I did? Why, when I expected a yield of good grapes, did it yield worthless grapes? Now I will tell you what I am about to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will tear down its walls, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland. It will not be pruned or weeded. Thorns and briars will grow. I will also give orders to the clouds that rain should not fall on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of armies is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah, the plant he delighted in. He expected justice, but saw injustice. He expected righteousness, but he heard cries of despair. In the original context, in Isaiah, it was all of Israel that did not produce fruit. It was the disobedience of Israel that Isaiah was preaching against. And this desolation then becomes a metaphor for the exile. And then, as we know, Israel would go into exile in Babylon. This is what Isaiah was predicting. In Mark, Jesus sets up a similar scenario with God planting a vineyard and the men and leasing it out, the vineyard being Israel. But in this case, the judgment comes upon not the nation as a whole, but the spiritual leaders. The tenant farmers now are the ones that are in charge of the vineyard, and so Jesus is speaking directly to them. That's why the chief priests and the scribes and the elders took this so personally. Quite frankly, because it was personal. He was talking to those that were in charge of the vineyard, and in this passage, in this short parable, Jesus does a really good job of giving in a sense, the overarching story, the meta-narrative, to use the technical term, of the scriptures up to his point, up to the point in history where he was. The story of the Bible, God creates and it was good. The creation and it being good is found in this vineyard that the planter, that the man, that God put so much effort into. Good soil, clearing the rocks, building the walls, everything was ready to go. But in Isaiah and then again in Mark, we see rebellion. We see sin enters. It's when we talk about the story of the scriptures, we talk about creation, we talk about fall, we talk about rescue. And here we are with creation and fall. And so throughout the Old Testament, we have a series of prophets that come and preach against Israel and their sins and that. And we see that parallel in the parable. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the farmers to collect some of the fruit of the vine, of the vineyard from them. This is verse 2. Verse 3, they took him, they beat him and sent him away. Verse 4, he sends another servant. And this one they hit and on the head and they treated him shamefully. So verse 5, he sends another. This one they killed. And then he sends many others. Some they beat, some they killed. We see this repetition and we see this building of how they treated him. First they beat one, then the second one they beat and treated shamefully. The third one they killed, and then there's this whole, in a sense, it's the parallel. It's analogous to how Israel treated the Old Testament prophets as they came and how they were treated. And finally, he sends his son. Verse 6, he still had one to send, a beloved son. That could be translated also translated as his only son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying they will respect him. But the tenant farmers said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him and inherit the land for ourselves." So they seized him, killed him, threw him out of the vineyard. The emphasis there is even on how they mistreated him. They killed him, and then reading between the lines, they just toss his body out. He doesn't even get a proper burial. He's just tossed away. Now, in the context of the vineyard, or in the context of the parable, this landowner might be seen as somewhat naive to keep sending people. And what was it? I guess it's attributed to Einstein that you keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. But of course, we're not pushing the metaphor that far. God kept sending his prophets over literally hundreds of years, addressing the people, giving them time to repent. Some did, most didn't. And then here we have in this parable Jesus again predicting his own death. He's done this 2-3 times before, and now he's again predicting his own death. This time maybe with a little bit more detail. He's talking about, this time he reveals who are the ones that are going to be responsible. He talks in verses that come about the judgment that will follow upon them. And then he makes this definitive statement in verse 10. He asks them, "Haven't you read the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This came about from the Lord and is wonderful in our eyes." In this sense, Jesus makes the definitive statement. In those 2 verses, he's really finally answering the question, by what authority do you do these things? And he says, because I am the stone that the builders rejected. I have become the cornerstone. And that the word in there that's cornerstone, some of the translations say capstone. Some say cornerstone. The words that we have in the scriptures could be translated either way. It could either be a cornerstone or a capstone. But I even love that metaphor, because if you think about it, the cornerstone, of course, what it is, was placed in the corner. It was the first stone that went in. It was the foundation. And from that cornerstone, all the other walls were built. And so that cornerstone was significant in the sense that it had to be placed right, and it went in first. A capstone was the stone that, in a sense, went in last. If you think of an arc, if you think of an arch. So you've got an arch of stones, and just before they meet, they're in a shape, the stones come up, and just before they meet, the last stone that goes in is the capstone. And the way that capstone was cut, it would force its weight down the arch in both directions. And that's what held the arch together. So I just think it's so great that you can see Jesus as either claiming to be the foundation, what has to go in first and from which everything else is built, or he's the very last, the thing that holds it all together. He's the Alpha, he's the Omega. This is the authority by which he does these things. And these are the two messages I think that we see in this parable. The first is what it tells us about Jesus and his authority, and what it tells us about the message of the prophets. Let's do the second one first. What it tells us about the prophets. Why did God keep sending prophets? Now, when we think of prophets, the first thing we probably think about is prophecy. The prophets predicted the future. We saw that in Isaiah 5, where the idea is that he's predicting the exile. So they're making predictions. We do that a lot around Christmas time, of course, in the Advent. We're quoting from the Old Testament prophets that talk about the coming of Jesus. But the second thing that prophets did, and probably did this more than in a sense of predicting, is they spoke what we refer to as, he spoke prophetically. And that is, in a sense, preaching against the sins of the people, preaching against the sins of the culture. So we also see that in Isaiah 5, where God is saying, I expected fruit, I expected justice, but what I see is injustice. What I hear are cries. So we have both, in that context in Isaiah 5, we have both prediction of exile, but we also have prophetic speech against what was going on in Israel. And so these are the two major themes that we see throughout the prophecies, throughout the prophets, are making predictions, but then also speaking prophetically. There are four major prophets in the Old Testament. Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah. And there's 12 minor prophets, who I'm not going to try to list them all. And basically, they're major and minor mostly because of the length of the books. The 4 major prophets are longer, the 12 minor prophets are shorter, and then there's a lot of other prophets that, for whatever reason, didn't get a book in the Bible named after them, but they prophesied, they made predictions, they preached against Israel, against the culture. They spoke prophetically towards the culture. But if you look at all the things they preached against a lot of things that were going on in Israel, a lot of sins and rebellion. But we can sum up the majority of their preaching in two ways, in two topics. They preached against idolatry, and they preached against injustice. They preached a lot of things. But the majority of what they preached could fall into those two camps, into idolatry or into injustice. Now, in the Old Testament, when these prophets are writing, the idolatry is literal. People are literally setting up idols to false gods, to the gods around Israel, the other nations around Israel, and worshiping them. Today, that's not so much the case, of course. But if we look at the idea of idolatry, basically I would summarize idolatry today as something or someone, anything or anyone, who becomes more important than God, who competes for God's attention in our life. And those can be really good things. That can be your job. That can be your family. That can be your hobby. The pursuit of money is fine until it becomes greed. The pursuit of stuff is fine until you're defrauding your neighbor to get it. Influence and power can be fine until you're aligning with the wrong kind of powers to get it. So when we think about what would be the message of the prophets for us today when it becomes in the context of idolatry, it's anything or anyone, something or someone that may become more important to us than God, the role of God in our life. And then injustice. A prominent theme in the prophets is the treatment of the vulnerable. A couple of weeks ago when John walked us through the triumphal entry, and he talked about Jesus coming in to Jerusalem on a donkey, he contrasted that with the war horse. You remember that? And then he used the illustration from Pastor Brian Zahn about there's always a dude on a horse. And as soon as you said war horse, I thought, I think I even mumbled it to Sue. There's always a dude on a horse. And 3 minutes later, you said it, and I was so happy. It comes out of this book, in a couple of books by Brian Zahn, but listen to this. This is just too good. I wanted to read it. One of the most remarkable things about the Bible is that in it we find the narrative told from the perspective of the poor, the oppressed, the enslaved, the conquered, the occupied, the defeated. This is what makes it prophetic. We know that, prophetic, not in the sense of prophecy, but in speaking against the culture. We know that history is written by the winners. This is true, except in the case of the Bible, it's the opposite. This is the subversive genius of the Hebrew prophets. They wrote from a bottom-up perspective. Imagine a history of colonial America written by the Cherokee Indians and African slaves. That would be a different way of telling the story. And that's what the Bible does. It's the story of Egypt told by the slaves, the story of Babylon told by the exiles, the story of Rome told by the occupied. What about those brief moments when Israel appeared to be on top? In those cases, prophets told Israel's story from the perspective of the peasant poor as a critique of the royal elite, like Amos, when he denounced the wives of the Israelite aristocracy as the fat cows of Bashan. Every story is told from a vantage point. It has a bias. The bias of the Bible is from the vantage point of the underclass. That was a theme over and over again in the prophets, the idea of injustice. And so come to how does that fit for us today? Anytime that we minister to, anytime that the church speaks on behalf of the vulnerable in our country or anywhere in the world, we are taking on that prophetic role as well. So the whole theme of the prophets can be summed up pretty legitimately in idolatry and injustice. Or, and I think this is what ties it together, when Jesus was asked how to summarize the law, what was the most important law? He gave two answers. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And the opposite of loving the Lord is idolatry. The opposite of loving your neighbor is injustice. So, what does all this mean for us? Well, the first is theological. Jesus is the final messenger of God. The book of Hebrews starts with the proclamation that God spoke to our fathers in many ways at many times, but he has now spoken to us in the final sense through his Son, through Jesus Christ. Now, there's no contradiction here. Just saying, though, that the New Testament interprets the Old, that Jesus is the final authority. But there's also a personal aspect to what Jesus says about himself as well. Jesus defines the kingdom, and he defines his kingship by saying he's the cornerstone, he's the capstone. As John said when he talked about Jesus riding in to Jerusalem, he said he was a king of reconciliation. And I would assume most of us here have experienced that reconciliation. That's why we're here. But if not, if you have not, this is my challenge or my to you today, as even as Paul would say, maybe this is the day to see Christ in that reconciliation sense as the King who reconciles. He's our final messenger. He is that rescue. If you think of the story of the Bible in creation and fall and rescue, he is our rescue. And then the second is, how do we respond to the story of the prophets? Yes, they were old. Yes, their situation is different. Yes, Jesus is the final word. Yes, we live under grace, but not law. But the prophets, the theme of the prophets, both in idolatry and against injustice, gives us a window into the heart of God and how he doesn't want any competition. So there's to be no idolatry in our life. But then also how we treat, as Jesus would say, the least of these is how we treat Christ himself. And so in this parable, we see Jesus not only answering the literal question, by what authority do you do this? But then 2 millennia later, we see a message to ourselves, the whole message of the scriptures of loving God and loving our neighbor as well.